Hi guys, and welcome back to another devlog. It's been quite a while since my last one. It's a very belated devlog. I think about 7 months at this point, and that's mainly because around October last year, maybe November, I'd done a pretty sketchy GitHub push. I don't think I'd actually had the project backed up, which was, I mean, that's an error in of itself. I'd had like 6 months worth of work, and none of it was backed up to GitHub or fork or whatever. And I finally decided to get around to doing that, and so I could work on the project on my laptop. And basically ended up scrapping, months and months of work all down the drain. Just it was just one of those moments where you've been working all day and you discard changes when because there's a new repository, there were no backups, so it all just went down the drain, and no amount of downloading recovery tools and scanning deep data could get the files back. So after a couple of hours of despair, contemplating all the months of work I'd lost, I took a couple of weeks off, but got back into it pretty soon because, in a way, it was a blessing in disguise. Before I lost the files, there's maybe 3 or 4 weeks there, and those 3 or 4 weeks are the ones that I guess I missed the most, because I think it was starting to take shape, and it was some pretty high quality code I was putting in, and changes and things were making sense with the project. But yeah, basically, in a way, losing most of last year's work was a blessing in disguise, because it allowed me to restructure the project and the direction for it. And I realized, I completely overscoped the project itself and what I wanted to do with it, to the point now where we're entering, I guess, year 2 of the project, even though realistically, since I started it back up again, it's been maybe 3 months, 4 months. So in a nutshell, I've restructured it in a way which is far more, I guess, streamlined. It's going to be more like Swords and Sandals, where it's like a very simple but satisfying game loop in pretty much just craft your spells, enter combat, defeat your enemy, go back, craft your spells, buy some gear, go back, fight more enemies. Basically that structure of just combat, gear up, and then back into it. Whereas before, as I've discussed in my previous devlog, it was just going to be too big, with a map that you traverse through, and quests, and all these different characters, and skill trees, and yeah. There's still quite a lot of stuff in the project in terms of where I want to take it, but especially these past few months, I think my technical skills with the programming, it doesn't seem too out of reach. I just hope that in a couple months' time, the features that are in will be fun and play worthy. But yeah, I'm no longer concerned as to whether I'll get it all in or whether it'll take 2 to 3 years to get it all in. I'm feeling like I'm far more on track now with this current foundation versus where I was at, before I lost all this data. So anyway, we'll jump into where we're currently at. What you're looking at, or what you've been looking at for the past, couple minutes as I've been rambling on, is the current state of combat. So I've got 2 AI opponents fighting each other, and this is a pretty cool thing that I basically got onto combat maybe 2 weeks ago, and this is the state of it now. I've been working on spell crafting and basically how I handle all of the generation of spells and effects in the game. You can create them in game, but I've also created editor tools so that I can create scaled abilities and spells for both the player and the NPC and save them to scriptable objects, so I don't have to, just wing it when it comes to creating dynamic or scaled abilities. So anyway, that's another devlog. But yeah, so what we've got here is 2 AI opponents, and they're basically just in a loop, eternally fighting. The cool thing is with this is that I've created some dev tools for when I eventually open this up for testing. And what that does is that pauses the game and that allows me to configure, so the left being this guy, the right being this guy, configure all the stats and attributes whilst in a play session so that I can, tweak certain variables, or when I'm testing. I eventually intend to include in this dev kit, or this toolkit, the ability to swap out gear, swap out abilities, things like that. At the moment, you can just change their stats. So, for example, if I type in vitality, which is like the core attribute associated with health and health regeneration, and I set the value to 50, it'll increase the chosen attribute by that much. So as you can see, the health jumped up by 500, I think is the conversion. 50 vitality, or 1 vitality equals 10 health. It's a bit buggy at the moment because I've been including so many new features over the past few weeks. And yeah, basically, like there's, as you can see, like the tooltips clip a little bit. I need to bring them in. I need them to detect the screen boundaries. And you'll notice if I unpause game, he'll basically take damage and it'll reset back to 35. And that's because basically I've got all these listeners for detecting, oh, does a character have a new effect on it, and if so, a lot of things will have to listen out for that effect change, such as attributes and stats. So anyway, yeah, it's a cool little feature which allows me to basically test enemy strength as well. Like the fact that I can do AI on AI is it allows me to just take my hands off, and I can be like writing notes, and eventually where I want to get with it is that like I'm logging, well, okay, well, if this enemy had these stats and this gear, how hard or easy was it for him to be defeated, essentially, and I'll be logging those notes. And I guess the equivalent of what I've got for that right now would be, here you'll see basically the enemy, and we'll talk about how AI operates. There's a cool system that I've included, which is, instead of just, to make it harder, increase stats. Basically, AI decision making is a combination of their intelligence and their aggression. Basically, intelligence allows them to override their base decisions, and it'll allow them to make more informed decision making based off like, okay, well, what's the current health of my opponent, and how many debuffs do I have right now? Do I need to clear them? And what's my current health and mana like? Like, should I go into attack or should I retreat? And intelligence basically informs those decisions. Whereas if your intelligence is lower but your aggression is higher, basically what aggression maps onto is like, the higher the aggression, the more reckless an enemy's decisions will be. So it'll disregard things like its own health or mana, and basically just always go into attack. And obviously the inverse of that is like, the lower the aggression is, it'll just always look to retreat. It won't be very offensive in its decision making. So playing around with these two stats, they both map from 1 to 10, and I think in another video I'll pop the hood at the code, and we'll take a look at how we cycle through all the different actions, because enemies are, at the start of each turn, they're receiving so many different actions. Basically, it's just like, well, you can move forward, you can move back, you can wait, you can use an ability. It scans through all of its available abilities. It scans through how many effects it has, whether they're debuffs or they're buffs. And if they're debuffs, it'll look to clear them. If they're buffs, they know that they don't need to reapply them. And then it will scan through their opponent's stats and effects, and be like, okay, well, I've got a spell which can, apply this debuff to my opponent, and I'll check my opponent to see if he's already got it. And if it doesn't, it'll increase the weight of the spell cast. So Obviously, if your opponent already has the debuff, it'll just ignore, like, be like, okay, well, I don't need to cast that spell because he's already got the debuff. But if it's missing, it'll increase the likelihood of him casting that specific spell. So it's this whole complex system which is still very much in development as I include more features and more decisions. But I think the foundation for it's pretty solid at the moment. Anyway, what we were looking at was the logging. So basically here we've got two combatants. So the two slots are taken up by the NPC slot, which is the guy on the left, and the enemy slot, which is the guy on the right. So if you can see here, I've included, instead of just spamming my console log with all of the decision making, I've isolated it to both of those combatants' script as a debug list, so to speak, of just different strings. So you can see here that when it comes to calculating an action, it runs through this thing. It'll add the actions, and when it's its go, we can see, like, when it comes to damage calculation, we've got crit roll, we've got damage, calculating the base, and then the effect multipliers, and all these things. So, like, we're constantly pulling logs for a character's decision making. So I can, like, really pull that data at the end of a combat session and, like, pull it out or assess it over a given amount of rounds, which is, I guess, the direction I want to take it in. It's just like, okay, so I set up a fight between enemy A and enemy B, and then tune their stats, tune their effects or their abilities, and then kind of pull the data yielded from these logs to assess scalability and difficulty and overall just the fun and the impact of a fight, between a player and an AI enemy. Further logging can be found on the root, so the NPC or the enemy themselves. This is basically what contains, like, all of the abilities, traits, stats, equipment, etc. And the enemy script here is what's responsible for all the decision making. And you can see here how it typically follows is, like, initializing new action calculation sequence. The first pass here is where we do a random assignment of either a defensive or an offensive action, and that's just, like, basically passing through an aggression check of whether a random number falls below the aggression amount. In this case, it's 5. If it does, then it's, offensive. If it's outside it, then it's defensive. And then basically goes through, and then you can see the types of decision making it's making. So yeah, it's pretty cool, as well as, like, as a final thing, and I need to refine this a bit further just so it actually yields valuable data. So if I quit a session, I'll get these logs at the end for the NPC, so the left-hand side AI, and the enemy. It'll pull their data here and kind of give me a post-fight analysis. So it'll tell me the intelligence, the aggression of the combatant. It'll tell me how many defensive and offensive actions they made. At some point, I'll look to make this like a percentage variable, and how many intelligence checks were passed. So that'll mean, like, okay, so for instance, scanning abilities to use, or scanning the need to heal, if their health is below a certain percentage, requires an intelligence check. And an override means, like, okay, well, your base decision was to do defensive, but based off all the data from your intelligence checks, it would be more valuable for you to do an offensive thing. And that means that it's overridden its base decision to do defensive and decided instead to do offensive. As well as just, like, yeah, how much damage it dealt, how much healing it healed itself for, and the amount of kills that it got in a session. But yeah, anyway, way more to talk about. Hopefully I can start whipping out a couple more of these. I think also I just deliberate on making them because I kind of want to make them structured and, cohesive. But at this point, I think it's far more valuable for me just to get things out there. So I think in the next one, I might dive into maybe some of the code behind, maybe start like, look further into the combat system and explain how it's going to work, and what the overall vision of the new version of this project is going to look like, and as well as maybe in a later one also explain the spellcrafting system, because for those who have played Morrowind, it's quite similar to that. You basically get a bunch of stats you can just chuck into a brand new spell template and increase things like, its damage, how many effects it has, the range, the cooldown, the mana cost, all these things, and they're all scaled by how much points you have, and that's determined by obviously your level and the amount of materials you have and all sorts of stuff. So that was what took the lion's share amount of time, but it's a cool little system which allows me to generate the types of abilities that we were using, or you saw the AIs using just before. So like just some generic ones I've made, like flame shot, for example. And I can just drag this into an enemy slot, and then it starts using it instantly. So an infinite number of spells and effects I can just use, and these are some of the effects that I've generated as scriptable objects. So yeah, they're all kind of applying themselves as needed, whether they trigger on crit or trigger by chance or deal damage or drain health. And I think setting up the infrastructure for that is what's taken so long, just to get this scene into a state where I'm ready to show it off. But I'll dive more into that in later devlog. So for now, I'll stop yapping, and yeah, hopefully you enjoy. If you've seen anything that you like in this video or want to give feedback on, whether it's the art style or questions about the creative decisions or direction of the project, then please feel free to reach out to me, leave a comment, whatever. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.